sustainability has gone out of fashion. I think it's a word that's broken and needs to be reinvented. It's been politicized and it now means 100 different things to 100 different people. I think the biggest lesson that I took from sports is that teams are made up of all sorts of different characters and you need them. And that leadership in the best organizations doesn't just come from one person, it comes from a lot of different pockets, lots of different people. You know, how the different disparate parts of a great team come together and how the distribution of leadership across that team is really, really important to drive it forward, and it can never really come from just one person.
What if your shoes could help save the planet? Tim Brown is the former professional football player who co-founded Allbirds, the world's first carbon-neutral footwear brand, proving comfort, style and sustainability can coexist. Since its 2016 debut, Allbirds has become a certified B Corp, a global retail phenomenon coined as the shoe for tech and VC bros due to their comfort and minimalist design, and it has inspired a whole industry to rethink materials and impact. Welcome to Reinventing Capitalism, the podcast where I, Claudia Thomas, decode the success of for-profit impact businesses through the stories of their founders. Our goal is to inspire you towards a purpose-driven career, because life's too short for boring jobs and soul-crushing corporations. Quick note before we get back to the episode. Just give me 30 seconds of your time. Two things. The first is a huge thank you for listening and tuning into the show week after week. It means the world to me. And the second is that we are just getting started. If you enjoy what we do here, please join the 14% of people that listen to this podcast regularly and follow us on this app. I promise to do everything in my power to make this show as good as I can, now and into the future. Thank you. Hi, Tim.
Claudia, good to meet you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for being here with us. Unfortunately, because of the geographic distance, we cannot have you on our studio in Barcelona, but I'm here anyways representing the space and making sure that we still make you feel part of our studio and our project of like having everything in person and evolving the show. So thank you anyways.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
So Tim, you are a professional football player turned entrepreneur, and you're not only an entrepreneur, you are the founder of Allbirds, which is a company that disrupted the fashion industry by making trainers with natural materials, which is quite a big statement. Could we please start by getting an overview of your upbringing in New Zealand and how did you become a football player in the first place?
Yeah, well, I was a professional footballer. It seemed a long time ago, but I grew up in New Zealand, just in Wellington, just the capital. At a young age, became really in love with football and was really fortunate to have an American auntie that pushed me to take up a soccer scholarship in America, and I played there, got my degree in design, which really had been a subject that I'd fallen in love with at school, and so I was able to combine education and sport. And then on the back end of that, got a little taste of playing for my country, or playing for New Zealand at the age group level. A little later than most, but that was really a powerful catalyst for pursuing a career in football. And I did that predominantly in the A-League in Australia, playing for an Australian team, and then for the one New Zealand team that plays in a sort of a combined Australian-New Zealand competition, and had 8 years of playing professional football. Really fortunate to be able to do that, but it was in pursuit of one goal, and that was playing for New Zealand and playing for New Zealand at a World Cup. And we were very, very fortunate to be able to do that in 2010. The second time New Zealand had ever qualified since 1982, first time in a long time. And it was a very, very special experience in my life that was beyond my wildest dreams in terms of what I was able to achieve in sport.
No, for sure. And very, very unique. Like, you must be probably like one of those like tiny percentage of people that have actually managed to, well, or achieved living such a unique experience.
Yeah, it was an amazing journey. I think was full of lessons and friendships that still live to this day. I think I realized that if you stick with something long enough and you connect it to a really exciting dream, that powerful things can kind of happen. And certainly when you do that in a context of a group of people, a team of people that really want something to happen. We were lucky, there's a bunch of things have to go your way, but at the end of that journey, I realized I'd taken the sport as far as I could possibly take it. And while I loved football, my real love was design. design. And so I used the World Cup experience as a springboard to retire. I tore up my contract at the time and went back to school to study all the subjects I'd avoided up until this point at business school at the London School of Economics back in London. So the sport not only was a wonderful experience in and of itself, but it was also a catalyst for the next chapter of my, what would become an entrepreneurial journey.
For sure. So you quit your football career. It seems like your passion was design. What drove you to study business at the time?
I'd been experimenting with the concept that would become Allbirds many years later while I was playing. I had been in my apartment in Wellington reading a magazine about the decline of the wool industry in New Zealand, a culturally really significant and important industry that had been in decline for a number of years. Now, most people who hear New Zealand think of sheep. Peak sheep in New Zealand is in the early 1980s, but it's been in decline ever since. Something like 80 million sheep at its peak, now less than 25 million. For a couple of generations, no young New Zealander has grown up really believing that farming and agriculture was part of the future of New Zealand's economy. So this was an industry in decline. I've subsequently came to learn that was on the back of the rise of synthetic fibers derived from petroleum that had started to dominate the industry. And I saw an opportunity to innovate and create a product out of wool in the footwear space. And that sounds like it was an immediate epiphany. It wasn't. It was really a curiosity and a creative project that I pursued on the side of football. I visited my first footwear factory in the off season that I found on Google. There was no business plan. I had no strategy. I was just really following my nose in a creative pursuit with the belief that there was an opportunity to use wool in a different sort of way. And that really was the starting point.
So that was even before you started studying.
I think that the early experimentation with this project started to get me excited about the potential of entrepreneurship. And you've also got to remember, Claudia, I was in my early 30s when I went back to grad school. Everyone else's careers, I'm sure yours was like this, taking off, and people knew what they wanted to be, and I was starting again. And the idea of entrepreneurship is something I'd read a lot about, I'd studied, and it felt exciting. It felt full of potential, and it felt like something that people couldn't tell me I couldn't do. And so it was definitely on my mind as I sort of went back to study again at LSE.
Yeah, actually, now that you mentioned that you kind of like had another start, how did you, was it hard to switch from being a sports professional to being seated at a desk behind of a computer, being inside of a class for a whole year? How did you manage that?
Well, I wanted to make that transition, and I was excited about something else. But even then, it was a shift in identity. It's all of a sudden quite an unusual and jarring change that even as prepared as I was for it, still became. And I remember it was like flying through the airport, and where they ask you what your occupation is, and I used to write sports person, and then I was like, I kind of write student. I'm like, that doesn't quite seem so good.
Yeah.
I'd had a lot of advice. I thought about it for a long time, and I knew that for me to springboard into the next chapter, I needed to have the courage to go backwards, and I needed to invest in myself. And so I went back and I lived in a dorm, and I took most of the money that I got from the World Cup and I invested it in going back to school. And I'd be lying if I said that was all clear. And there was moments in time, particularly when I'm in London, particularly in January, for anyone who's lived in London in January and it gets dark at 3:00 in the afternoon, where I'm like, what am I doing? What have I could have stayed in football. I could have done something there, stayed in New Zealand where it was comfortable, but I took a risk and I went backwards, and it was extraordinary. And I along the way met a couple of professors and teachers that really changed my life and helped me find the next path forward.
So you kind of had the idea already that it's kind of sprung from the wool and your background in New Zealand. How do you start cooking that idea, and how does it start becoming something?
Well, I just did it. I mean, so there's sort of really three insights, and the first one was around natural fiber and the idea that there was an opportunity in wool. And I applied for and won a research grant. And just to give people some indication of the time horizons here, this is probably circa 2008. I read the magazine, and over the next 4 years, I applied for and won a research grant that I partly funded to develop a material for use in footwear, and it took a long time, was really difficult. I knew nothing about it, but we stuck with it, and I had a couple of really supportive people, who helped me get that across the line. And then I retired, went to the World Cup in 2010, retired from football in 2012, went back to school, and that was the first time that I started to think about this as a business. I had 6 pairs of shoes that I had made. I'd been through hundreds of prototypes, and I finally had, the beginnings of a product that I thought was something. And I took an entrepreneurship class actually on exchange at Northwestern University, at Kellogg School of Management. And I walked into a class run by Carter Cast, who was this incredible professor. And for the first time, started to think about this as a business. And so, that was 5 or 6 years of fumbling with the idea of making a product. And it turns out that making shoes is really hard. Making shoes out of materials that have never been used before is very, very difficult. And so, I was fumbling my way through it. And then I met this one professor who sort of said, "Oh, hang on a minute, this could be a business. So why don't you think about it that way?"
You just mentioned it's very hard to make shoes from materials that have never been used before. Did you want to make your shoes sustainable from the start, or that's something that came as the idea evolved?
It evolved over time. And so the first insight, natural materials. The second one was that there was an opportunity to design shoes more simply, that the category itself was crowded, complicated, and tended to have flashy, bright logos on top of it. I was sponsored by one of the big sportswear companies when I played, and everything had logos. And in New Zealand at the time, it was very, very hard to find simple. So natural materials and this simple, and those two insights drove this next chapter. There was no sense of the environment or even a word like sustainability. I'm not quite sure I had been in contact with that as a concept, or even really knew what it was at that point. It didn't come until much, much later, many years later, when I met my co-founder, who, in the same way that I had a vision for product and for materials, had a vision for the environment, had been working for a biotech company in the sustainability space, and believed that the world was going to change and going to need to change, and that all the products and services that we use every day were going to need to be fundamentally reinvented, and that the fashion industry would be more than likely at the forefront of that change, led by consumer demand. And so it was much, much later, many years later. In fact, in 2015, when I got together with Joey, my co-founder, and we co-founded Allbirds, that really the purpose was infused into the story. So it was not there at the beginning.
Wow, so interesting that you had already kind of like a hint of what was coming, and you just like built this company which would resonate with consumer trends much later on. Like, I find it very interesting that, like, I don't know, maybe even unconsciously you had that drive.
Yeah, but I think when I go back to my childhood, there was an appreciation, I think, for just take something like natural fiber. Like, my mum would make me check the tags and labels and make sure that we didn't buy plastic stuff. And but I don't think that was driven out of a sense of purpose. It was maybe a feeling that it was healthier or better. Yeah. And so the starting point, and I think this is a really interesting, potential jump off for our conversation here about the broader topic around sustainability, that the focus was always on a better product. It was on a better experience, and quite frankly, a confusion that natural materials had been put on the shelf, that they were no longer used. And it felt like there was this miraculous fiber in merino wool that was being underutilized and in decline. And so there was an opportunity, for creating an experience. And that was really at the core of what, took this idea and turned it into a product that really took off, was that it was it was a comfort experience. It was the wool regulated temperature. It was incredibly soft. It wicked away moisture. There was just this amazing experience that no plastic thing was ever going to be able to replicate. And so, I think oftentimes purpose, don't get me wrong. I mean, I'm a huge champion of purpose. It drove my sporting career in terms of playing for New Zealand, and certainly the way that we conceived of Allbirds and the dent that we wanted to make in the world. But oftentimes people conflate, doing the right thing with the right business direction. And you have to think about that really carefully and be very intellectually honest with yourself, because otherwise I think you can get lost. And
yeah, absolutely. You get lost and you don't really know why you're doing things.
Yeah, I think you often know why. You want, I think that's what's so interesting about the moment that we live in, that was probably different from our parents, that we believe that business can be a force for good. We've grown up understanding, almost taking for granted, a movement like B Corp that has sort of really slept swept the globe in terms of being broadly adopted as a framework for constructing businesses that think beyond just the profit motive in terms of their broader responsibility for the communities in which they operate. And that's a really positive thing. And so, but that doesn't mean that we get off the hook with building great products or great businesses that sustain and pay people well. And, certainly that's been a big focus for us from the beginning at Allbirds.
Yeah. So you've had many amazing successes. You raised $100,000, I believe, on your first Kickstarter campaign. You sold 1 million pairs of sneakers in the first 2 years. I believe it was Time magazine that named Allbirds the most comfortable shoes in the world. How do you feel after all of these successes as a founder?
It's funny. The whole journey, let's be really, really clear that, going to the World Cup was kind of a piece of cake relative to building a business. And I don't say that sort of facetiously, just in terms of like the complete and utter commitment that it takes. And I think entrepreneurship in the best of ways has become a popular topic. And yet we need to warn people that it's also extraordinarily difficult and full of challenge. And even in those moments that you mention, that I have a great deal of pride in. And look, this whole thing started after Carter Cast, the professor I mentioned, encouraged me to put this on Kickstarter. And in 4 days, we did $100,000 worth of shoes. And it was the first time really this had gone from curiosity project to business. And equally, I know in that moment, when I shut that campaign down after 4 days because we only had enough wool for 1,000 pairs of shoes and they sold so quickly, I was sitting there with a deep knot in my stomach knowing that this was going to be really, really difficult and that it just got harder. Careful what you wish for. When you have success, the expectation of performance ratchets up. And so even all the way through to our IPO, oftentimes the moments that were most celebrated publicly were the ones that you were sitting there going, oh gosh, this is it's about to get much, 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 much harder. And can we do it? Are we good enough? So equally, the moments of real difficulty, in hindsight, you look back on when everyone had kind of given up and you were with one or two people that still believed and you were rallying around, were actually the source of a lot of satisfaction. So it's complicated to look back on some of those things.
No, absolutely. And actually, like, you touched on exactly my next question, which is, how do you balance, celebrating these milestones with remaining grounded in the ongoing challenges of building a company? Like, what is, I guess, an advice for someone that is building something so that person doesn't get like blindsided by the good things and can still stay humble towards everything that it's coming, and even more so if it's something that it's likely to grow and become successful?
Yeah, it's complicated. The entrepreneurship thing, I think requires also an ability to believe in something that is so unlikely, that hasn't yet been created. It almost needs some form of sort of supernatural confidence to believe in something and to overcome the inevitable setbacks. When I think back, the number of experts, quote unquote experts, that came out of the woodwork, to tell me that this would never work, that shoes were too hard to make and I didn't know anything about it. You needed to sort of somehow have something inside of you that said, no, I'm going to go kind of prove you wrong. But I think there's a couple of questions or points, I think, in the background of your question, which is, overall, generally, we tend to overestimate what we can do in the short run and underestimate what we can do in the long run if we stick with something long enough. And I think sport teaches you the power of compounding, the compounding impact of getting a little bit better every day at something. And in the course of a season, you'll play many games. Sometimes you'll play really well and lose. Sometimes you'll play really poorly and win. Ultimately, in the fullness of time, the best teams usually win the season. That's the kind of the way it works. And so I think you learn, that you just got to keep with something. And if I look back on the journey with Allbirds, just around the corner from the darkest moments were the inflection points that kicked us forward. And with the support of a lot of friends and family, I had the courage to kind of just keep walking through those moments, and then that's when it started to sort of work. And in my experience, most people just give up, and they give up because they're not prepared to sort of really go through the difficulty of doing this, because it is hard. And then other times it's not connected to a broader purpose that allows them, the fuel to kind of do that. But that's certainly been my experience.
Hi, Can I ask you a quick favor? Every week, we dive into the stories of founders that do more than just make money. Our mission is to prove that a career in impact can be both purposeful and financially sustainable. If you believe in creating meaningful work, share today's episode with one friend who's ready to make a difference. It would mean a great deal to me. Your support is what keeps this show alive and growing. Thank you. What are other lessons that being a professional football player taught you about leadership or about resilience? Anything that you've applied to building Allbirds?
All of it, really. As my co-founder liked to point out, I didn't really have a choice because all I had done up until founding Allbirds really had been kicking a ball around for a living. So my lessons in leadership and building teams really come from that. And I continue to believe that there is an incredible trove of information and insight to be taken from the world of sports. In terms of how teams can be formed in particular. I mean, at a high level overall, I think we tend to be obsessed a little bit with leadership as a topic, focus a lot on the founder and the CEO, and rightly so in some cases, certainly in the context of an entrepreneurial idea, that first person becomes really important. They have to believe, they have to have a vision. But as you start to sort of raise money or grow your business and actually build a team, I think the biggest lesson that I took from sports is that teams are made up of necessarily the best teams, all sorts of different characters, and you need them. And that leadership in the best organizations doesn't just come from one person, it comes from a lot of different pockets, lots of different people. And you need different types of characters, different personalities, people that will be humble and people that will be confident in different moments. And you need to have an appreciation for those and an empathy for those differences. It, of course, needs to be connected to a culture and an understanding of what the group is going, but where the group is going and what it's trying to do. But I'd say that's the biggest lesson I took from sports is, how the different disparate parts of a great team come together and how the distribution of leadership across that team is really, really important to drive it forward. And it can never really come from just one person.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love this thought because I feel that oftentimes companies hire for very specific requirements, and they kind of want everyone to be the same. I don't know, certain universities or backgrounds both in terms of university or where they come from. And this, I think this thought really reiterates that diversity really enriches whichever environment you are in.
I think that's totally right. And of course, when you're hiring for a role, you're looking for functional excellence. And it's the same as true in sport. You want someone who's striker is going to be able to score lots of goals and a goalkeeper that's going to be able to prevent them. I mean, that's clear. But I think in sports, you learn an empathy for the folks in a team that buy deeply into the culture, that approach things with a complete selflessness in terms of putting the team first. Then you realize how valuable that can be, particularly when the chips are down. And yet when you're in an environment, and we've all been in them, where people are clamoring to take credit for things, it usually, however talented that group is, it's usually not a long-term path to sustainable success. And so I think sport teaches you that. And I don't know that we have a great deal of understanding of what to call these folks that exist as performers in their own right, but also as glue for the broader culture. And I think at Allbirds, we had a bunch of those folks. And it takes a long, that you tend to not notice them, you tend to take them for granted, but they're there and they show up at every event and they remember people's birthday and they invite and include people, and they are the thing that stitches a team together. And which is not to say the star performers that want individual credit are bad either. You just need a mixture of these folks that are going to bind together. And I think sports gives you a unique kind of understanding of how that can work really, really well.
For sure. You also mentioned that having people in your team that have the same mission and then can look towards the same direction, it's very important. What did you mean by that? Do you mean the mission of the company and having everyone on board with that?
Well, this is one, there really is 3 jobs for any leader. And the first is to set the vision and to own it, and by extension, the strategy. I think, secondly, they've got to continually connect the business to the customer. Every business is going to have a customer, and oftentimes you lose sight of the fact that, hey, you're making shoes and those shoes need to be incredible and they need to be beautifully made and designed with great quality, and then the experience of how they're delivered needs to be incredible. And doing that once is one thing, doing it at scale and relentlessly with quality is another. And then the third thing, and this can only come from the leader, is they need to set the tone for the culture and the way that the business operates and the standards that they accept. And so, you know, an organization has to have those things, and the leader is heavily responsible, well, not solely responsible for all of it, but certainly for setting a lot of the structure around it. And it's a unique alchemy of these things coming together. And I felt it twice in my career, once in a sporting context where we were in pursuit, a small group of people in pursuit of going to a World Cup. The goal was very, very clear. It was lofty, but it bound people together. And similarly at Allbirds, a small group of people came together with an idea that we were going to make shoes and build an extraordinary business, but we're going to do it for a larger reason. And that was that we believed that natural materials had been ignored by the broader footwear and fashion industries, and there was an opportunity to help nature make a comeback. And binding all of those things together is not easy, but when you are a part of that, and you know when you are, there is no better feeling, I don't think, professionally. And so, you know, I reflect a lot about that. And it's easy to say, much, much harder to do, and you need a little bit of luck. But certainly those ingredients and those framework of three things from the leader are really, really important.
Do you think that a more basic level of sports can teach you similar lessons?
Yeah, I think, look, I think lessons can come from everywhere. And I was really, really fortunate, and I continue to still think that I am fortunate to be surrounded by people to learn from. And I mentioned a couple of them, professors and teachers. There was leaders within sport that I would take little notes from. I've kept a diary and a journal, and you know, since I was really 16, and I've unashamedly stolen ideas from everywhere, and so I think all the best people that try and build something do that almost automatically, and you've got to believe that in the fullness of time those things add up, that sort of mentality of constantly wanting to try and learn and to improve. And certainly I'm close to sports. I grew up in the world of sports, and so, but there'll be the same in music or theater or cryptocurrency. I mean, wherever you worked or whatever it is that you did, there'll be lessons, and I've certainly tried to approach it that way.
Let's move on to the topic of sustainability. What does sustainability mean to you?
I think it's a word that's broken and needs to be reinvented. It's been politicized, and it now means 100 different things to 100 different people, and we could go through the list. Animal welfare, circularity, recyclability, end of life, water quality, land quality, and then you start to get into the science of carbon accountability, and so on and so forth. And all of those things are important, but it's extraordinarily complicated. And if you're not careful, it can become meaningless and confusing, which I would say is the current state of affairs, or even worse, politicized and controversial and disconnected from what it really means, which is we have a fundamental need to reset the way that we interact with the environment, and we need to do that in a way that doesn't have a negative impact. And at the moment, that's not the case, and we need to change that. And we're beginning to see the implications from a climate perspective of not doing that, and those things are only going to worsen. And yet, even for the most well-intentioned people, because I would say certainly with young people, you put your hand up and you say, hey, do you care about the environment? Everyone's hand's going to go up. The more challenging question is, what do I do about that in my day-to-day, and what's right and what's wrong, and how do I tackle this extraordinarily, the definition of a complicated problem. And so I think this word is part of the problem at the moment. And I would argue that sustainability has gone out of fashion, and yet we know it's going to come back stronger. And when this turns from this current political climate, we're going to learn a bunch of lessons from maybe what we got wrong in this first chapter of trying to attack this problem.
Why do you say that it's gone out of fashion? Is it because of, well, you tell me.
Well, trust me, I'm not suggesting that it's any less important. In fact, it's more important every day that we find ways to lessen our impact on the environment. I would just say, as a term, I think what you see in this current political climate is people rolling back, large organizations rolling back climate commitments. I think you have a general sense of skepticism in consumers
Mm-hmm.
who have been a little quite frankly, unsure of all the commitments and promises that have been made, and a lack of kind of clarity or clear understanding of kind of how we evaluate good and how we don't. And there's no shortage of good intention in my mind, and yet you click on and products are labeled sustainable, and yet we don't quite actually really know beyond the idea that they're possibly using some recycled components exactly what that means. And so I just think that the people are a little jaded, a little confused, and a little skeptical. And I think the current climate around sustainability favors big companies and it favors reporting, and it doesn't necessarily incentivize innovation and creativity.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that we need to pivot off sustainability, which is a technical, scientific term that tends to make you think of all the things that you shouldn't do, and move towards a more structured way of talking about this that is creative. You know, when you're struggling to put food on your table and you hear the word sustainability, particularly in the world of agriculture, to give you one example, you assume, hey, I'm going to be in trouble here and something's going to cost me more, and it's most likely going to be less good. And that's a problem. And
Yeah.
so we need to find a softer, more inclusive language that also realizes people need to succeed economically, and that sustainability can't just be a problem for rich people. It's got to be something for everyone. And then we've got to find a softer, clearer, better way to understand it so that we can tackle it with enthusiasm and energy, and not sort of some foreboding sense that we're all doing something wrong.
Do you think that this confusion that comes from consumers, it's because of the lack of appropriate definitions within the sustainability realm?
Yeah, I think it's like any sort of significant change. This is what happens, is that we lack a kind of a clear framework for evaluating it. And as I touched on, it's complicated. I mean, just because you improve biodiversity might not necessarily mean that you improve your carbon footprint. In some cases, wool and natural fibers can have higher carbon footprints than some recycled synthetic materials. So this stuff is complicated, and there's puts and takes, gives and takes. And at the same time, there is still this lingering sense that if I'm buying a sustainable product, it's more expensive and less good. And so we have to be fundamentally focused on business models and product experiences that don't just compete but exceed the status quo to really drive this forward. And the electric car is a good example where all of a sudden that's become synonymous with faster and better and more luxurious. And that's when you have breakthroughs and tipping points. And we're just at a stage now where there's, even with animal welfare in the context of certain standards of ethically caring for animals, there's 100 different certifications, carbon footprints, something we understood really, really well at Allbirds and tried to promote. We're one of the first companies in the world to label all our products with our carbon footprint. And there was a lot of criticism. What does this mean? I don't know. Are you actually telling the truth? And this is just all this is just the nature of the moment that we're in. But it'll settle down and it'll calm down. And like anything else, it won't all happen at once. There'll be dominoes that fall. And I have a perspective that something like plastic is a really good example of a domino that people are awakening to in a really large and big way. They're going, hang on a minute, we've got to stop using this stuff. It's not good. It doesn't biodegrade. I don't like it when I go to the beach and I see it everywhere. We're starting to understand, I think, and we'll continue to understand as smart researchers uncover this, that plastic is not good in our water supply and in the oceans. And so I think it's a really good example of when this zero yo-yos back, that people will have a clearer sense of, okay, plastic is bad versus an amorphous and complicated topic like sustainability.
Yeah. Within the topic of sustainability, we have your recent launch of Moonshot. Tell us about it. What is Moonshot?
So we at Allbirds, we tried to pick a path through the complex world of sustainability, and we obviously were founded as a B Corp. We did a bunch of things to to connect to certifications within the way of doing our business. But the question of sustainability for us started to form around this idea of carbon and carbon footprints. And we chose that as our North Star, which is not to sort of say that the other things didn't matter, but it was really what we tried to make the sharp point of our innovation. And it was a new thing, and I'd liken it very much to calories on food. Carbon, no one really knows what a calorie is, and just because your calories, are low, doesn't necessarily mean you're having a healthy diet. There's a broader context in nutrition around vegetables and vitamins, and so is true in sustainability. But carbon allowed focusing on the carbon footprint allowed you to look at an organization like Allbirds and say that's part of a broader jigsaw puzzle and a broader global carbon footprint that we need to reduce. And Allbirds is a small part of that. And equally, we could boil it all down to our individual products and we could label them with the footprint of their impact from start to finish, including the use of the product. And that for our design teams and for our creative teams, we could actually work to lower that impact at the same time that we designed and made more product. And we made a broader commitment as a business called our flight plan to reduce that number in half, which we've been on track to do. And what was amazing to see is that within our designers and our creative community, there was an extraordinary understanding that they were making things that were going out in the world that they wanted to improve. And so traditionally, when you're making a product, you think about three things. You think about what it costs, you think about what it looks like, and you think about the utility of it. All of a sudden, our design team had a fourth factor, which was the carbon footprint. And they knew that every product they were going to make was going to have a scorecard effectively. And that got us really excited. And then all of a sudden, the question becomes, how can we reduce that? And we partnered with Adidas on a collaboration, which was really special a few years ago. And we tried to make the lowest carbon footprint trainer that we could. And it was 2.79 kilograms, I think, about half a hamburger. And then internally, we were like, well, what would it take to actually create a net zero product with no impact, with no offsets, like within. And so we set off to do that. We called it Project Moonshot. We felt like going to the moon was really difficult, but it had been done before. And we released that product recently, and we're really, really proud of it.
Another thing to add is that it's a very cool shoe. Like the design of it, the aesthetics of the shoe, it's very futuristic. It also has that maybe moonshot.
No, I appreciate you saying that, and I believe that this is what's so exciting as we start to embed frameworks around environmental impact. That's going to necessarily create constraints, and those constraints are going to shift very subtly and slowly at first the form language and the aesthetic of the products that we use. There's a new design language for sustainability that is in the process of being created that's really exciting. And again, to use the electric car example, freed from the constraints of a combustion engine and the traditional way a product is made, the form of an electric vehicle is different, and the headlights and the components. And you can kind of know on some level when you see that, because it's different. And so too will be products made in this sort of way with a consideration for carbon and the environment. They're going to change and they're going to evolve. And that's really exciting. And it shifts this from the just being a conversation about doing less bad and moves it towards a conversation about the creative potential of the objects that we use every day. We're going to still keep buying shoes, and we're going to still keep buying t-shirts. The challenge is to make those with no environmental impact, and do that in a way that still delivers on the creative excitement of a very well-designed thing that we want to wear.
For sure. And also, like, as we've seen, for consumers, it's not enough that a product does good or that a product is sustainable. You also need that cool, fashionable aspect within products so that consumers actually buy it.
I think that's totally right. I mean, at Allbirds, with all good intention, we've discovered that when we lead too much with the jargon of science or sustainability, we confuse people, we turn people off.
Yeah.
And yet the evolution of this is not to talk about it, but to do it, and to do it in a really meaningful way. Again, for all the doom and gloom around that conversation at the moment, I continue to see such great intent, such incredible innovation, and a growing understanding that even takes something like plastic is not good enough, and we need to innovate away from it. And so I continue to be really hopeful and encouraged about the path forward.
For sure. Me too. This August, it's the 10th anniversary of Allbirds. How are you celebrating? That's my first question.
There's lots of reflection and lots of pride. There's lots of incredible people that have come and been a part of this. I mean, and Joey and I, my co-founder, it's a really special moment, and yet it also feels that it's just the beginning, and we've got a long way to go. We always believed that there was an opportunity to build a sustaining company that lasted for 100 years and really was a big part of helping make nature make a comeback in the context of fashion and footwear. And it feels like we're only just at the start of that journey. But we're going to re-release our original product, the Wool Runner. Jamie McClellan, a New Zealand designer that I was one of the first people I met on this journey. Him and I have done a lot of time sort of telling stories. There's a Maori saying, "Kamua Kamuri," which basically translates to walking backwards into the future. And we spent a lot of time thinking about the early days of this and why we founded the business. And oftentimes when you're imagining the next chapter of the next 10 years, the answers lie in the past. And certainly that's true when you think about the broader conversation we're having around sustainability in the environment. Earlier generations understood this. And a lot of the answers lie in the past to the future and to the future of solving some of these problems. So it's a moment of great pride that we've come this far, and a lot of people to thank who have contributed to this journey. And that's certainly sort of how we'll be approaching it.
Who is someone you wouldn't be here without?
Well, there's really obvious ones. My wife and my brother and my mum and dad. And if I've had an unfair competitive advantage, it's been that support network.
Yeah.
Even in the darkest entrepreneurial sort of moments, keep on going. And if you really fall, we'll catch you. And not everyone has that. And so of course that's the answer. But I think maybe for me, I'd point to 3 teachers that I had. One at design school at the University of Cincinnati, Gordon Selko, who passed a little while ago, who Carter Cast, I mentioned at Northwestern, who really helped kick me on my entrepreneurial path. And then a professor at LSE called Ignacio Palacios Huerta, who helped me get through the dissertation somehow. And both of those guys are still friends and mentors to this day, who have helped me believe that the jumble of ideas in the notebook could add up to something. And so those teachers have been really instrumental for me, and I definitely couldn't have got this far without them.
Yeah. Do you have any single milestone or moment that specifically stands out as you look back on these 10 years?
Oh, there was one moment where we were in the early stages of kicking the business off, and my mum called me in New Zealand, and Jacinda Ardern, the New Zealand Prime Minister at the time, had just met the Australian Prime Minister, which is a big deal, and had given him a pair of Allbirds. And I, in Mum's mind, it couldn't get any better than that. And and it was one of those little moments where you're like, oh, actually, we've created something here that's moving in ways that we could never have imagined. And then you realize, as we approach 10 years, like I sort of mentioned, it was all the underdog moments. It's usually connected to people that were there to kind of help you just go a little bit further on the end of a phone when you were struggling, and that some of the most satisfying moments were actually the hardest. And it's really, really hard to understand that at the moment and at the time. But I feel very, very, very grateful for the experience at Allbirds, and very, very excited that it's got so much further to go.
Something that I love about this answer is that you're basically saying that your favorite moments were the most mundane ones, instead of looking back into like maybe a flashy success. Like you can be really appreciative about just the day-to-day things that happen. Yeah,
there was this parable of the farmer that I got told at one point not that long ago that I thought was just bang on, Claudia, and if you'll indulge me for a second. So there's a story of this farmer, and he has a horse, and he farms a small plot of land, and one day the horse runs away, and all the villagers from the, nearby come to him and say, what terrible bad luck. And then the next day the horse returns with 5 other horses, and the villagers say, what great, good fortune. And he says, we'll see. And then the next day, his son is trying to break in one of the new horses, gets flipped off, breaks his leg. What terrible bad luck. Oh, we'll see. And then there's a bloody war starts in nearby, and the army comes through recruiting soldiers for what would turn out to be a catastrophic conflict. And his son is unable to join because of the broken leg. So I thought it was wonderful. Oftentimes the things that we think are going to be great end up in the fullness of time not being that. And
Yeah.
some of the things that are the most challenging moments end up being gifts. And I think if you can hold that in your head, certainly as you go through the wild ups and downs of an entrepreneurial journey, and then much like sport, you're able to sort of see that somewhere deep down, whether you're doing the right things. And if you do them for long enough, even if you lose some games in the short term, in the fullness of time, you will win. And most people just quit too early. And if you stick with it for long enough, good things can come. And that's certainly been my experience at Allbirds. And I feel very, very grateful for all that has come my way through that.
For sure. No, I can imagine. 10 years, it's like a long enough period to like have a very holistic kind of view or view of like everything that has changed also, because the company must have changed, but also you probably have changed a lot, and how you like see the company or like what you're able to do with the company, it's completely different.
Yeah, I think that's totally right. And you have a lot of gratitude for people that have believed in your journey and continue to believe in your journey. So as a general rule, I don't think we say thank you enough. We're so on to the next thing, busy, and certainly these milestones I've learned along the way as a moment to show a lot of gratitude and appreciation. And certainly that's what we'll be doing as we celebrate our 10-year anniversary early August. So
how are you celebrating? Like, are you doing anything with the company?
yeah, there'll be the relaunch of this product and a bunch of storytelling we've done around our history. That some of it will be external, some of it internal, and it'll be a celebration and an opportunity for us to sort of chart a path forward and launch a whole bunch of new product that takes the lessons and learnings from the last 10 years and plows it into a new generation of product and built from natural materials, which is really the core idea that's been there from the beginning of Allbirds. So it's exciting. And as the conversation around sustainability evolves, we continue to believe that there is most of the answers lie in nature, and that we have become addicted is probably the right word to making things out of plastic very cheaply. And there's an awakening within a consumer that's starting to demand to know the provenance of the things that they wear and buy. And I think we're really well positioned to continue to contribute to that story and that change and shift.
Yeah, for sure. Well, Tim, I think this is like the perfect ending to this interview. I think I cannot say anything else. Can end it in a better note. So thank you so much. I've loved learning a little bit more about you, and also love to get to know you at this point in your career where it seems like you have reflected a lot on everything that has happened, and it does seem that the word that comes is gratitude. So I just love to see that, and I hope that the next 10 years continue to bring you so much light.
Thank you so much for having me, Claudia. This has been really lovely. Thank you. I appreciate it.